What's up, everybody? We are live at the HQ for the Mosby Heritage Area Association, and we're here for their history camp going on today. And I wanted to introduce you to two of my friends. You may recognize these guys because both these guys have been on my podcast, the Tattoo Story Show. We have Travis Shaw and we have James Taub. And as you see, they are finely dressed gentlemen today. And I wanted them to talk about Rev War uniforms, Rev War material culture. And I'm going to hand it over to them so they can take it away and talk about what they're wearing and why they're wearing different colors and the uniforms and equipment. Guys, I'll tell you what.
You want to go ahead?
Yeah,
Get
sure.
things started. All right.
So I'm portraying a member of the 17th Regiment of Foot. This British regular who served during the American Revolutionary War of the 1770s, early 1780s. And I'm portraying one of the many soldiers who have just been a private in the line. And for the most part, this is how the 17th and most British line infantry soldiers would have appeared throughout the entirety of the American Revolution. The only differences are the ones that are specific to my regiment. So I have a red coat, obviously being a British soldier, that's faced with white, and then I've got specific lace and then specific buttons that denote that I'm in the 17th. Now, British regiments aren't supplied by the British Army per se. The colonel of the regiment actually purchases the equipment for the men, so there are some slight variations, even especially when you get down to the individual equipments like the bayonet belt or the cartridge pouch that are just slightly different. And of course, there's also some varieties depending on which campaign you're in. Be a little different in the winter or if I'm campaigning in the south. Now, the British soldier, as we're talking about, we like to think of the 17th, which was later assigned the county title of Leicestershire, as being, prim, proper English soldiers, but these guys were from all over. The 17th, being a traditionally English regiment, has men from both the Highlands and Lowlands of Scotland. A lot of the officers are actually Lowland Scots gentry. They've got men coming from Ireland, where the regiment was stationed before they were sent to America, and they also have men from England and Wales, as well as several German recruits who actually served with the regiment. So it's a very diverse regiment that sees action all over America, most famously at the battles of Princeton, at the Battle of Stony Point, where most of the regiment's captured. They have detachments at Yorktown, they fight at Monmouth and all over in New York. So what I'm here portraying is just that standard British soldier who would have been serving in America during the war.
How about you, Travis?
Yeah, I'm a little different. As you can see, I'm in a green coat. I'm portraying a sergeant in the Queen's Rangers, which was an American Loyalist regiment. And this is what they would have been wearing in 1777, 1778. In fact, it's what almost most of the provincial or American Loyalist regiments would have been wearing during that time period. The English ship over 5,000 green uniforms with white facings, round hats for these provincial troops, because what they find when they take New York in the summer of 1776 is there are a lot of Americans who are not necessarily in favor of the revolution. There's a lot of Americans willing to take up arms for the British. The Queen's Rangers is just one of dozens of those regiments. They're going to become one of the most famous Loyalist regiments during the war. They fight in almost every major campaign of the war. They fight so well that they, along with 4 other Loyalist regiments, are chosen to become part of the British Army establishment. They become the first American regiment on the American establishment, which is pretty cool. Like many Loyalists, the members of the Queen's Rangers will leave America after the war. Many will go to Canada in particular, New Brunswick, Ontario, that area. So where you just were a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah, I was just in Ontario.
You were in Loyalist country.
Yeah, I was in Loyalist country, and I love being in the Ottawa Valley and up through Upper Canada, as we would say. So how many layers are you guys wearing, just so people at home know the layers, and it's all wool?
We're actually wearing very similar things. We were both wearing linen trousers, gaiter trousers. Underneath we have linen body shirts on, and then wool waistcoats, wool coats. So we got 2 layers of wool on. It's a little warm, but like any other natural fiber, the wool is actually going to breathe a little bit more than like your modern synthetics. So it's hot, but we're probably no hotter than anyone else here. So.
What about the weaponry as well?
Exact same weapon. We're both carrying replicas of a British land pattern musket. These are what are issued to British troops, Loyalist troops. It's kind of the standard infantry weapon. Many Continentals are also carrying these, either from captured stores or from kind of pre-war stockpiles. It's a 75 caliber weapon, although typically you're going to fire a ball a little bit smaller than that for the sake of ease of loading. I don't know, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I say this is variations of this musket are the main British firearm for well over 100 years.
Yeah.
You start seeing British soldiers being issued with what they nicknamed the Brown Bess after the War of Spanish Succession in the very early days of the 18th century. And British soldiers aren't carrying something all that different from this at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Just some slight variations to it. So this is a weapon that stays with the British Army, and there are even guys still carrying weapons very similar to this in the Crimean War in the 1850s when they start to go over to a percussion system.
I think the Mexicans are using Brown Besses during the Mexican-American War. So, I mean, this is a weapon that in one form or another is in use for a century, like you said.
And these are smoothbore. There are riflemen, though, correct?
There are rifles in use in both the American and the British armies. You know, rifling makes the weapon much more accurate, but it also makes it much more difficult to load. Your rate of fire is significantly lower, so both armies will use them in smaller numbers. You know, maybe 10% of the army is going to be armed with rifles so that they can pick off high-value targets, you know, officers, artillerymen, and so forth, while the bulk of the fighting is being done with troops armed with smoothbore muskets.
Yeah, I would say that the main point of a battle in the 18th century isn't necessarily to kill or wound your opponent, it's to physically drive them off the field. And you see this in British strategy throughout the war. They're constantly trying to take the American capital, take various supply depots. They're looking at that as being their main goals of the war versus defeating the American army in the field and making it impossible for the Americans to continue fighting. So
I was going to say, in some ways, very similar to the first few years of the Civil War. You know, the drive is always to take Richmond, not necessarily to, like, wipe Lee's army out.
To outmaneuver each other.
Right.
To get behind.
To take these strategic points.
And so you'll see with the riflemen, you'll see them deployed in various different ways. Obviously, sometimes they raise full regiments. For example, the local regiment raised here in Northern Virginia is the 3rd Virginia, which is just an amazing regiment to study. When they're raised, they actually have 8 companies of men armed with muskets and then 2 armed with rifles. So, and you see Virginia regiments raised early in the war, pretty heavily similar to that. So.
Right. I mean, just a few miles from here is Berryville, Virginia, home of Daniel Morgan, probably the most famous rifleman of the war. Yeah. You know, and as I said, the British are using them too. About 1 out of every 10 British light infantrymen is given a rifle, and again, it's, you know, the combined arms, what we'd say today, of having, you know, the high rate of fire and then some guys who are capable of giving accurate fire.
So we just passed through the 150th and 155th Civil War, just passed the centennial of World War I, although we're still involved in Siberia and all that kind of stuff, which we will for a while. But we're getting ready to hit the 250th of Rev War stuff. So how are you guys fired up about that? Ready to rock and roll with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I kind of got into this hobby hearing stories of the 250th and how big a deal the bicentennial was. And so I'm really looking forward to, like, there's a lot of great scholars out there getting a lot of good work out there. Our friend John Reese just released a great book on African Americans in the Continental Army. There's, you know, so many great institutions out there, new museums that are popping up. I can't wait to collaborate with these organizations. I mean, it's going to be an exciting time.
I completely agree, and I think that it's one of the things I'm most looking forward to about the 250th of the Revolution is how we change as Americans viewing the Revolution.
Absolutely.
Because I think growing up for me, and for most of us, it's always kind of been a black and white story. And through talking about stories of, say, the Loyalists, or the British regulars, or just the everyday people who were in Northern Virginia or Southern New York or wherever, or even people in England or in France or in Canada, how they experienced the time around the American Revolution, I think it's going to pretty heavily change. So I'm really excited to see what new ways both academics and then public historians are going to be able to get out and teach the people just the truth, or what we now understand as a better truth of the American Revolution than we have at any time previous.
Yeah, just more research, telling more different stories, looking at different approaches to the war, maybe not even necessarily concentrating so much on the military aspects of the war. but sharing all those stories. I mean, next year, kind of the first 250th event in my mind, 250th of the Boston Massacre is next year.
Right.
I mean, it's coming a lot sooner than we think. So
I hope to be there.
I hope you are too. I hope to be there.
This is the first time someone can be excited to go to a massacre.
Right.
But it also happens every year. So
A massacre
spoilers.
happens every year?
Yes.
Spoilers.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, you know, one of the reasons why we chose to do this program here at the Mosby Heritage Area is we really wanted to tie this area to these stories, because no battles happened here in Northern Virginia during the war, but as Jim was saying, the 3rd Virginia is raised out of this area. The militia is heavily involved. The women and other civilians in this area are vital to the war effort. They're raising the crops, they're producing the uniforms and things like that. And this road right in front of us, thousands of British prisoners were marched up this road after the Battle of Yorktown. So even though there's not a battle here, those stories are an integral part of this area. So
one of those things that I'm super excited to see change is this focus of, I love Philadelphia, my dad's side of the family's from Philly, but I think that there's certain areas of the country that have been super heavy in Rev War history, or like here in Northern Virginia have been very heavy into the Civil War history. There's tons of battles in the Civil War here. But I grew up in Michigan, and there's Revolutionary War stories all the way out there. I mean, you've got Clark's Virginians serving out there, trying to attack Fort Detroit. So one of the things that I'm super excited about, again, is this broadening of the geography of the general interest in the American Revolution. So,
and I think one of the good things that came out of the bicentennial, and I hope will come out in the 250th, is we have this idea of the American Revolution as the foundation for a lot of the values that we hold as a nation. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, no matter where you're from, whether your family just got off the boat or if they've been here for generations, the things that bind us together as Americans are the ideals that these guys fought for and died for. And I know that maybe that's kind of a rosy view of things, but this kind of emphasis on patriotism as citizenship, as like looking out for your fellow citizen, and all that. I hope to see a lot of that as well. Maybe I'm optimistic, but
Optimism is a good thing.
Yeah.
Optimism is a good thing. But thank you guys for showcasing this on my feed, because as we go into the Rev War 250th, I think we're going to have a lot more of this coming up in the news feed, because a lot more events are coming up. I know that there's a lot of brainstorming going on as to what we can do in the future to bring it to more of my followers and followers all around the country who follow other pages. So I appreciate you guys coming on here and allowing us to video some of the stuff that you got.
Great. Yeah, we're happy to do it.
Yeah.
Anytime.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in, guys.